An interesting exercise in any Christian context, church, denomination, religious institution, is to ask them to define gospel. My, how we love that word. There is hardly a word in the church's vocabulary more favored than gospel. We need to share the gospel. The church is a gospel organization. The mission of this church is to spread the gospel. Gospel, gospel, gospel. But ask those same people to define what they mean by gospel, and once you get past gospel comes from a Greek word that means good news, what you'll get is a vague, vacuous, vapid feeling that God grades on a curve, or that God has very low standards. Thank God. It is, as someone has described it, a sort of sloppy agape. The gospel asks nothing, demands nothing, and too often does nothing. It's kind of a naive, gullible, Pollyanna sort of good news, which is fine, except for one small problem: it isn't. The gospel is the good news one hears only on the far side of the bad news. Without the bad news, we would never know the good news, and therein lies the problem. C.S. Lewis was approached by the BBC way back in the 1930s to do a series of broadcast talks on the nature of Christianity with a view to reintroducing Christianity to an increasingly secular and religiously ignorant British society. The talks eventually became the book we know today as Mere Christianity. The BBC originally proposed a series of talks around three themes: what Christians believe, Christian behavior, and Christian theology. Lewis responded by saying that he liked the idea, but insisted that another series of talks precede those as context for and preface to the Christian faith. He then explained, Christians believe the gospel, the good news that God in Jesus has set right what has gone terribly, undeniably, gravely wrong, both with human beings and their world. In short, the gospel is good news precisely because everybody knows and believes the bad news. When the New Testament was originally written, that was clearly so. You will look in vain in the Gospels for a detailed description of the dilemma we're all in, precisely because you don't have to explain what is already fully known and universally accepted. People knew that they were in deep trouble and unable to extricate themselves from it. And so when the first Christians came preaching that God in Jesus had acted decisively to save us from the mess we're in, that was both welcomed and received as good news. But nowadays, Lewis continued, nobody believes in the bad news. They think they are just fine, thank you very much. And so Christianity, with its call to confess and repent, its diagnosis, if you will, is not heard as good news in today's world. On the contrary, it is bad news. I mean, seriously, who wants to do that? But whether you hear something as bad news or good news often depends on where you're standing at the time. You have to have an operation. Bad news or good? Well, it certainly sounds like bad news. But what if that statement were preceded by this one? We found cancer, but we think we caught it in time and surgery should take care of it. You've got to have an operation. Now, is it bad news or good? You see, the gospel is good news precisely because we know and believe the bad news. Remove the bad news from the equation and the gospel is not good news at all. And there lies the biggest challenge in sharing the gospel in today's world. Many people, even those who should know better, no longer believe that there is any bad news. But as every physician will tell you, diagnosis is a necessary part of cure. And the gospel is good news only if we know and believe the bad news. And so if I were to ask you to define the gospel, what would you say? The gospel is good news? Well, true, it is. But that is only a half-truth. The whole truth is that the gospel is good news because we are in big trouble. You know it, and I know it. Without the resolve and resources or resilience to redeem ourselves. Left to our own devices, we are not going to make it. Enter the gospel. And not a moment before. Keep that in mind when you try to explain the gospel to someone, even someone who ought to know better. Till next time, take care. God bless.